Welcome to this lecture on the Synoptic Problem. Uh, what the Synoptic Problem is sounds pretty complex, but what does the Synoptic Problem? Uh, what is the Synoptic Problem? In short, it's the literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But what does synoptic mean? The prefix soon is this word synoptic is a Greek word um, that we've used in English quite a bit, but in the sense of synopsis. So soon or sin is a prefix for the Greek word meaning with or alongside. Optic is simple to see. That's where we get, optic nerve comes from this word. So synoptic literally means to see alongside or to see beside, putting things right beside each other. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke can be put side by side and then read along together. And this is an example right here on the page here. You got Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side. And you can read along the side by side like this because Matthew, Mark, and Luke follow the same chronology. Most of the major stories of Jesus' life and ministry are in all three of these Gospels. So that's where we get the word synoptic. You can sit these three Gospels beside each other and read along. So uh, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they are the synoptic gospels. And I created this little kind of chart here of Matthew, Luke, and Mark to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing. So these are the synoptic gospels. And so what's the problem, right? What's the problem with the synoptic gospels? The problem is this kind of what is the literary relationship between these gospels? And here is a pretty complex chart right now. We're going to get back to this at the end. But I do want to show you what this looks like because it's a pretty good chart. The synoptic problem is the relationship, the literary relationship between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mainly because there are large sections of material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are verbatim. They're exactly the same word, same wording. And where these three are the exact same, scholars believe that Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source to write their Gospels, which is why Matthew and Luke follow the same chronology of Mark and record many of the same events. And if you look at Luke, the prologue to Luke is Luke chapter 1, 1 through 4. Luke says that he consults other sources while he's writing his gospel. So it's good that we have evidence in Luke that says that he's using sources. So we believe that both Matthew and Luke have a copy of Mark when they're doing this. Now, the where all these three agree, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke say the same thing, that's called the triple tradition. So you might hear the triple tradition and the double tradition. The triple tradition is that space where all three agree. But Mark in priority, which only means that Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. Mark in priority is the strong agreement among scholars that Mark was written first and then used as a resource by Matthew and Luke. And Mark in priority solves the problem of how Matthew and Luke relate to Mark. But this is only one part of the problem. So if Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a resource to write their gospel, you know that this is why it makes sense that they are all so similar. Now, why Mark in priority? Why do we believe that Mark is the first gospel written? Well, it's the shortest of the gospels. And, it kind of stands to reason that most scholars agree that it's most likely early because later writers would probably expand on what's already been written rather than delete and consolidate. In other words, What's more likely, that Mark would have a copy of Matthew and Luke and delete entire sections of those gospels and then narrow those gospels down and make a shorter gospel that would not include a birth narrative and that would have a much shorter resurrection story? I mean, that's highly unlikely. So most scholars believe that Mark was used by Matthew and Luke and expanded. So the lack of birth narrative and the muted resurrection that we already talked about in our discussion about Mark seems to indicate that Mark would have come first than rather than later. So in most and also in most cases when Matthew and Luke agree with Mark, they have extended versions. So it looks like Matthew and Luke are filling out the story that Mark started to tell. And if you remember in Mark, we talked about Jesus' baptism. This is, Mark chapter 1, something like verse 11 or something like that. Go back and read it, because Mark uses all of about 3 verses to tell the story of Jesus' baptism. Now, go to Mark, read Jesus' baptism in Mark chapter 1, and then go to Luke chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 3 and read the baptism of Jesus in those stories. It's much more in depth. It is an expanded version in Matthew and Luke. Same thing with Jesus' temptation, much more with the resurrection. So everywhere that Mark is used by Matthew and Luke, or where Mark agrees with Matthew and Luke, Matthew and Luke tend to expand on Mark. And that just makes more sense than somebody looking at a longer story and then condensing it down in just a couple of verses. So nearly all of Mark, this is the other thing, nearly all of Mark is contained in both Luke and Matthew. So why would someone edit either Luke or Matthew and substantially shorten either of these Gospels and delete entire sections like the birth narrative that make up some of the most more important material in Matthew and Luke? So these are all reasons why scholars believe that Mark was written first and then used by Matthew and Luke when they wrote their Gospels. So that solves the problem of how Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree with each other. Now, let's go to another problem. The other problem in the Synoptic Problem is how Matthew and Luke relate to each other literarily. And the Q source is how we deal with that. So here's this other problem. Once we agree that Mark was used as a resource, we also have this problem that Matthew and Luke, there's these large sections of Matthew and Luke that are almost the exact same, and those sections are not in Mark at all. So, how's this happening? The Beatitudes is one example of this. Matthew chapter 5, 1 through 10, and Luke chapter 6, 20 through 22. This is where Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are the poor." Luke and Matthew both have that in 2 different versions, but none of that material is in Mark at all. So there are sections that Matthew and Luke have in common that are not in Mark. So it seemed to indicate that Matthew also had a copy of Luke, or that Luke also had a copy of Matthew. I mean, that's how you can understand where Matthew and Luke would agree with each other. So there might, that might be one scenario. But the problem with that is that there are large sections of Matthew and Luke that are completely different, specifically the birth narratives. So Jesus' birth in Matthew chapter 1 through 2 and Luke chapter 1 through 2, these birth narratives are completely different. I encourage you to get both of these, the birth narratives, and read them alongside each other. They are fundamentally different stories, and it's impossible to reconcile these 2 accounts if Matthew or Luke had a copy of the other's gospel when they wrote their own. In other words, if Matthew wrote his gospel with a copy of Luke in front of him, why would he totally disregard Luke's birth narrative to write his own? Or vice versa. Why would Luke totally disregard Matthew's birth narrative to write his own? That is hard to explain. It's much easier to believe that Matthew and Luke actually did not have a copy of each other in front of them. So we believe that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark when they wrote their Gospels, but Matthew and Luke did not know each other, and they did not know each other's Gospels. So Matthew's completely ignorant of Luke's Gospel, and Luke is completely ignorant of Matthew's Gospel. And most people think they were written about the same time, which would complicate the factor in them knowing each other or knowing each other's handwritten gospel. So this is the other major problem with the literary relationship within the Synoptic Problem. How does Matthew and Luke relate to each other when in some sections they are the exact same and in other sections they are completely different? How do you solve the problem of the literary relationship between Matthew and Luke? Scholars believe that both Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark. That's what we've been saying all along. That's Mark in priority. But they also had another common source. So both had Mark. Most scholars also believe that they had a source that has been lost to history. And this is what we now call the Q source. Q comes from the German word Quelle, and Quelle in German only means source. So it's kind of dumb. The Q source would be something like saying the source. But we don't have another word. We won't have another name for it. So the Q source sticks. The Q source provides an answer to the literary relationship between Matthew and Luke. In almost every case where Matthew and Luke agree with each other, and this material is absent in Mark, the material is a speech or a sermon by Jesus. Now, you've already known because we already talked about Mark. Mark doesn't have extended sermons by Jesus. Well, Matthew and Luke do. So most likely Matthew and Luke had Mark, and they used Mark as a source, but they also had this other source of sayings or sermons of Jesus, and they included those sayings and sermons into their Gospels, and they wove those sermons into the fabric of the narrative of Mark. So they follow Mark's chronology, but they include these large sections of teaching or sayings from Jesus. Now, what kind of gives us a stronger case for Q is the fact that we actually have found the Gospel of Thomas, 1948, in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Some shepherds found a bunch of documents, and one of them was a Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is nothing but sayings of Jesus. So there's evidence from history that there were these Gospels that had nothing but sayings of Jesus. We believe that the Q source is exactly that, a bunch of sayings of Jesus that both Matthew and Luke had when they wrote their Gospels. So kind of back up to these two charts. The two source hypothesis is the fact that is a hypothesis that when Matthew wrote his gospel, he had at least two sources. He had the Gospel of Mark and the Q source, and he wrote his gospel based on those, and some other information that is unique to Matthew. Luke likewise had a Gospel of Mark and a Q source, and he wrote his gospel. And so where Matthew, Mark, and Luke all agree, this is where Luke and Matthew are using Mark as a source. And where Luke and Matthew agree, this is where they're using Q as a source. Now, the other more complex diagram here does kind of fill out this picture with a little bit more information. So the triple tradition here is all in purple. That's where Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree. And so you'll see in that triple tradition, 76% of Mark is used in that triple tradition. So And so Mark makes up 45% of Matthew and 41% of Luke. You can see how heavily they use Mark as a source just based on these percentages. Now, that double tradition there in dark blue, 23% of Luke and 25% of Matthew, comes from that double tradition. That double tradition is the Q source. That's where we believe that Matthew and Luke are using another shared source. So Matthew and Mark, there is a section of Matthew, 10% of Matthew, is where he uses Mark, and Luke doesn't use that section of Mark at all. So Matthew actually uses more of Mark than Luke does. And where Luke uses Mark and Matthew doesn't, that's just a very small section. And then there's not large sections, but sections of Luke and Matthew that are unique to them. 35% of the Gospel of Luke is unique to Luke, 20% is unique to Matthew. And what's fascinating about these sections that are unique to Matthew and Luke, this is where you really get to see the theology of Matthew and Luke. Like, how is Matthew reworking the Gospel of Mark for his theological purposes or for the purposes of his audience? How is he handling the Q source? Same questions apply to Luke. One place in particular is the Beatitudes. This is where they're using the Q source. Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Luke says, "Blessed are the poor." So there is a fundamental difference between blessed are the poor and blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke would later say, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, for they shall be filled." Matthew says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," or hunger and thirst for justice. I think those are fundamental differences. And we see that Luke and Matthew are utilizing their sources in different ways and for different reasons. But that's how the Q source and Mark in priority answer some of the problems around the Synoptic Gospels literary relationship. So if you have any question, I know this is kind of complex, but go back and reread Ehrman's section on the Synoptic Gospels. Re-listen to this lecture until this becomes real second nature, because this is an important part of New Testament scholarship, and it kind of solves the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke relate to each other based on literary stuff. If you have any questions, please send me an email.